Were you ready to leave the political situation happening in the UK? You'd resigned, hadn't you, from your position as Brexit counsellor at the British Embassy in Washington. You resigned in 2019 because you were concerned, as you said at the time, about half-truths and not totally honest messages being delivered to British citizens about Brexit. You'd left that behind. Is it sort of fair to say that you were ready to move on politically as well from the UK to the United States?
Took a little while for me to make that transition. And by the way, as a diplomat, I tend to pick my words very carefully. So half-truths is probably being a little kind to the kind of nonsense that the Boris Johnson government was spouting about Brexit. Now that I'm no longer a diplomat,
go on. Yeah.
Willful disinformation and suppression of relevant information for businesses and farmers and fishing communities and people who've been affected very badly by Brexit. And I do want to make it clear that I didn't resign because I thought it was, my decision to say that Brexit per se was not right. It isn't illegal or immoral to want to leave the EU, but it is unethical to lie about the consequences and willfully deceive the British public and our allies in America, where I was representing Britain at the time, and willfully try and pull the wool over their eyes about the consequences of Brexit. And that was what pushed me over the edge, because it's incompatible with the civil service code of requiring integrity and honesty. But no, I mean, I really loved the UK. I didn't anticipate that this is where I would end up. But I had a kind of awakening after I had left the Foreign Office, and I was reflecting back on what had happened in the UK. And I realized that Brexit was a symptom of a far deeper malaise within British society, that actually government was not functioning very well, that there was a very unholy system of patronage and cronyism between politicians, the press, most of which are owned by very wealthy owners who don't even base themselves in the UK, and unfortunately also the palace. So you introduced me as a small R Republican. I mean that in the sense that I no longer believe that we should have a royal family. And it's not because I have any dislike for the individual members of the royal family. I appreciate that they are a symbol of the country, they are historical continuity, and many of them try to do very good works. But they are a kind of albatross on the UK modernizing and entering the modern age. And as long as we have a royal family, we can't get rid of the House of Lords. And it's a nonsense in today's age that we have inherited peers sitting in the House of Lords.
Yeah, and
it's a nonsense that politicians can nominate cronies to become members of the House of Lords.
So you paint a picture there, really, broadly, of an undemocratic system. And I was going to ask you what you make of the new Labour government, whether they're operating as you expected them to, whether the system will change under Labour or whether it will just simply continue as it is.
Well, I just saw that the government has issued a reply to a petition to consider introducing proportional representation. And their reply was that they were not convinced there was a case for it. So I think if the system is seen to work for them, they will stick with it. I have to confess that I think ethically, this government will be a more competent and ethical government than its predecessor, although that's a pretty low bar given how much the Boris Johnson government was scraping the barrel by the end of its tenure. I do think the fuss over Labour leaders accepting freebies, it's not on the scale of the corruption that dominated the Conservative government, but nevertheless, it's also problematic. That is not appropriate by any government. I'm just really disappointed that this government is still shying away from levelling with the British public about where we are on Brexit. I mean, we've just seen I'm in the US now, but I've been following the news coverage, for example, of the farmers' protests. And I'm sympathetic to farmers who are worried about losing their livelihoods. But on the other hand, what's hit farmers really hard is that they can no longer get seasonal workers to pick their crops, and they can no longer trade as easily into the EU.
Yeah. And their subsidies
we've
have
negotiated
been cut and and
Yeah,
not replace properly the
exactly.
EU subsidies.
And these are things that need to be honestly discussed, but there remains a conspiracy of silence within the British system that is scared to have an honest conversation with the British public, most of which, by the way, are now coming to understand the full implications of the Brexit deal that Boris Johnson negotiated.
Why are we scared then to have that discussion? I think there's definitely a Brexit malaise. I think a lot of people think it's done, it's decided. We just need to now look at how we deal with this in the best possible way. Forget about the secrets that were kept, forget about the misinformation surrounding it. You call it willful disinformation. Is it a conspiracy of silence, or is it just cracking on with it because we've got no choice now? Yes, we can make tweaks when the next Brexit deal comes up, and Starmer will do that as we understand it. But broad sweeping changes, no, too late.
Well, it may be too late because it's also possibly the case that the EU won't be willing to make significant changes because actually they got by far the better end of the deal. The trade deal that was negotiated has given the EU far better access to our market and made our goods far harder to enter their market. So it's kind of a good outcome from their point of view. Um, I mean, I don't know what is guiding the current Labour government. I don't have an in with them. I mean, my observation is it's political caution because they were worried about turning off people who were tired of Brexit or who had supported Brexit. But I think they're a little bit behind the curve, personally. And since they have said that growth is their prime mantra, economic growth, you can't have economic growth if you are negotiating with one hand tied behind your back and cutting off trade to your largest trading partner, which remains the EU. So, yes, they can get tweaks to the deal, but that's not going to change the fundamental situation.